We started talking about attention, and we're going to continue that today. So again, here's a classic example of attention from a group of voles where this animal, presumably if this were a real photograph, obviously it's doctored, but the animal is trying to stand out from the others. So that, keep in mind the difference between attention and grouping. So attention, I'm focused on one particular thing. I'm looking at you, right? Whereas grouping, I'm just sort of taking a large entity into account and not paying attention to the individual details. So it turns out that there are several different kinds of attention that I want to talk about briefly. I've already talked about feature-based attention last time in the visual search task. And I noticed I included the same slides in this lecture, which I'll be skipping over because I already talked about it. So the idea here is between overt and covert attention. So let me ask a question of you. So suppose you're in a class and there's a person of whatever sexual persuasion you're attracted to who is particularly attractive to you. Are you likely to sit in class and just stare at that person? No. So what would you do? If you were really attracted to this guy, if you didn't want to just stare at him, what would you do? You might furtively glance over every now and then, or better yet, right, you attend to the periphery. Guys get caught at this sometimes, you know, if you're married and you all know what I'm talking about, right? So you really want to avert that direct gaze. So we can think of overt attention. That's where you turn your head and eyes and face the thing that you're attending to, or what's called covert attention, where you keep your eyes fixed over here, but you have a pretty good sense of what's going on in the periphery. And that's covert attention. Space versus feature-based attention versus object-based attention. I'm going to talk more about that today. We've already talked about feature-based attention. So an example of that would be searching for somebody in the class with a maroon shirt, or searching for someone with blonde hair, etc., right? Where you're trying to focus on a particular feature. And then we'll also spend some time talking about voluntary and involuntary attention. So there's some aspects of attention where you're in control of it. So I tell you, look for a blonde person. Right? Your brain is telling the rest of your body, scan the room, searching for a blonde person. There are other things. So for example, if somebody ran in the door and shot a gun in the ceiling, I guarantee you would all turn over and look at that and stop paying attention to me for that brief moment. That is involuntary attention. And we'll talk more about that a little later in the lecture. Now, there are a couple ways we can measure the effects of attention. One is that, and this is the most common one, I think everything I'm going to talk about today involves reaction time. So the idea is that if I'm attending to something, I will respond more quickly than if I'm not attending to something. All right? So there are a number of students in the class who are from cognitive engineering. Attention is a big problem they have to face. So suppose you're an operator in a nuclear power plant and, you know, there are 10 video screens that you're supposed to be looking at where nothing ever happens. And, you know, you could doze off perhaps. That means on the occasion where something does happen, you're likely to miss it. Where if you come in and you're hypervigilant, you're much more likely to catch it and catch it quicker. Now, ironically, there are lots of tasks like that that monkeys are much better than humans at. because you can food deprive a monkey, right, and then test them every now and then for what they're supposed to be attending to, and they get a little drop of food, and they can attend for long periods of time without dropping off. Well, I cannot imagine a scenario where anyone would try to justify having a monkey look at the monitors of a nuclear power plant rather than a human, even if they're vastly superior in their performance at detecting bad stuff. So we'll see a number of examples as we go along of how we can use reaction time to measure that. The other is you get finer perceptual discrimination. So if you're doing a task, for example, where you're measuring contrast sensitivity, like we talked about a couple of lectures ago, if you're like a Psych 100 study that, does the stuff just by sort of pressing keys, and you're not going to get all that good results. But if you have a subject that is really attending to what they're supposed to do, you'll get much better results. There's a real skill to being an observer in experiments like that, because it's really easy if you're trying to discriminate things where you think, what shall I have for dinner tonight? And then the stimulus is gone and you have no idea what was shown. All right, so let's first talk about space-based visual attention. And this is is largely attributed to a very prominent cognitive psychologist in the 1970s and 80s named Michael Posner, who was at University of Oregon. They had one of the, when cognitive psychology made a comeback after the fall of behaviorism, they were one of the first groups that really got into that. And a lot of the paradigms that we use today were developed there. So the idea here is that you're attending to a target and you get a cue, right? You're attending to a fixation point and you get a cue that says a target is likely to occur in this region. Then it turns out if the target actually does occur in that region, like you show here, your reaction time is quicker than if you didn't get a cue. On the other hand, is if the target doesn't appear where you cued, there's a cost to that, and your reaction time is slower than what you would get if you didn't have a cue. I'll show you some examples of that in a bit. Feature-based attention we talked about last time, where here you're trying to detect a diagonal line amongst a sea of vertical ones. So this is where you get pop-out, where you're trying to search for a particular single feature, as opposed to this case where you're looking for a conjunction of features. So this would be a red diagonal line. And that's much harder to find than the single feature case. And then finally, we have what's called object-based attention. Good example of this is here. Let's pick on you. Tell me what you see here.
I see like a face superimposed over a large building.
Yes. Can you see them both at the same time? Actually, you can't, because if I get you to attend to one and I ask you questions about the other, you won't be able to ask questions about it. But I'll give more concrete evidence about that in a second. So these are the different types of visual attention that we're going to worry about. Let's talk now about spatial attention. So here's the idea. You have a fixation point. There are two locations where a target could occur. All right, let's say it's a number and you have to say whether it's even or odd. Or it's a letter and you have to say whether it's a vowel or a consonant, something like that. Or you just have to say, did a target appear there? So you're staring at a fixation point and you see the two possible target locations are up there. And then one of the target locations, there's a red box that blinks on around it. All right, that's the cue that tells you the target has a 75% probability of occurring here rather than there. All right, so if you're looking, I see the two targets there, and I'm looking straight ahead, but I'm covertly looking at you because the target's more likely to occur at that location. And then the cue disappears and the target then appears. In this case, it's at the cued location. This is a valid cue. This is sometimes called an exogenous cue. So you don't have to do any mental processing to get at that, right? It's a blinking light that catches your attention automatically, and it's located at the position where you're supposed to attend to. Here we have a case where the cue is called endogenous. So this requires a little bit of processing. Here you have an arrow that's pointing to the right, and this says that the target's going to occur here 75% of the time. Notice in this case the target actually appears over here. So this is an invalid cue, an invalid endogenous cue. So the distinction between endogenous and exogenous has to do with how much processing is required to understand the cue, right? So if, let's say, these are the two locations and I, wave my hand over here, your attention's automatically going to be driven there. Whereas if I just printed the student's name, you'd have to remember which student had which name, There's much more mental processing that's required for the endogenous cue. And here are the typical results you get from an experiment like that. So we have 3 types of trials. A valid trial, this is where the cue is correct. So the cue is telling you it's going to be to the right, and the stimulus actually appears on the right. Invalid trial, where the cue is telling you it's going to be on the left and the stimulus appears on the right. And a neutral trial, where you get both locations cued at the same time. And so the cue really isn't telling you anything about where the target's likely to occur. And here's a common pattern of results you'd get from an experiment like this. So when the cue is valid, notice that the reaction time here is about 230 milliseconds. When the cue is invalid, it goes up to over 300 milliseconds. So for a valid cue, there's a boost in performance by having the cue. Valid cue is correct 75% of the time. Invalid cue is correct. It's invalid 25% of the time. So you get a benefit if the cue is correct, and you get a cost if the cue is incorrect. And then notice also that the neutral cue is right in between, right? So you get the cost and the gain are about equal to one another. So if the cue is right, you get a benefit. If it's wrong, you pay a cost. Now the other thing, note here that this is also common. You're a little bit faster to the right of fixation than you are to the left of fixation. Any ideas about why that might be? Yeah?
The hand, probably. If people use right hand more, the left brain and the left fixation will get a quicker response?
Well, you basically have the right answer. It's not so much the hand, it's where your language is located. So the language is for right-handed people, is on the left side of the brain, right? And so it processes the cue a bit faster. It's also more where reasoning kinds of things happen. It's processing cues a bit faster than the other side of the brain does. Now, the other thing that people look at is how far in advance the cue appears. So let's suppose now that I present the cue for 1 millisecond. And then immediately present the target. Right? So you get an arrow for 1 millisecond, and then the target appears. Is that arrow likely to help you?
No,
Why not?
because they are almost haven't seen it.
Yeah, you don't have enough time to process it. And so, but it turns out that the delay that's required to get the best effect is much longer for exogenous cue than for an endogenous cue. So if it's a symbolic cue, right, the cue has to be presented about 200 milliseconds before the stimulus comes on in order to have an effect, whereas the peripheral cue works in about half that amount of time. All right, so if I blink a light on where the target's likely to appear, you process that faster than if you have a symbolic cue, like an arrow. And I'll talk more about this later. It turns out that blinking lights, transient in the visual field, are really important for capturing our attention. So here's another task. Another researcher, Charles Erickson, was at University of Illinois, again in the 60s and the 70s. He's quite a character. He's like 6'5", was a farmer, in addition to being one of the most prominent cognitive psychologists in the world. Even today, a lot of the paradigms that we use, a shocking number of them were developed by either Posner or Charles Erickson. And this is one of his most famous studies. So the basic idea is subjects get a string of letters, and if the peripheral letters don't matter at all that matters for performing the task is the letter in the center. All right, so the idea is if the center letter is an H or a K, you push a lever forward. And if the center letter is an S, you pull the lever backward. All right, and so you do that as fast as you possibly can. H or K forward, S backward. Now, the center letter is flanked by a number of other letters, and those other letters, if they were in the center, could either be would indicate a compatible response. So here you have an H and it's surrounded by Ks, but H and K, if in the center, give the same response. Whereas in this case, you have an H and it's surrounded by S's, right? If the S were in the center, you'd pull it the other way. And what the results show is if these things are packed close enough that you're always faster when the peripheral elements would indicate a compatible response than if they have an incompatible response. So if you think about it, right, in an optimal subject, they wouldn't pay any attention to those flanking letters. They have absolutely nothing to do with the task. But what these results show is that the subjects can't ignore them. They get processed automatically. And so if the brain is saying, hey, I've got some letters telling me to go forward and some letters telling me to go backward, you get confused and you're slowed down. If they're both telling you the same thing, then, right, everybody in agreement and you do the correct response much quicker than you would do when they're incompatible. And the other aspect about this is if you spread the flankers farther away, the size of the effect drops off, right? So the flankers, in order to give that response, the compatibility effect, they all have to be within like 1 degree of visual angle in order to see that effect. And results like this sometimes led to the notion of what's called a spotlight of attention, right? So if I'm attending to your nose, right, there's a small area around it that I'm also attending to, but it drops off after about 1 degree of visual angle. Now, it turns out to be a little bit more complicated than that. This is an experiment by Downing and Steve Pinker. Actually, I don't know that that's Steve Pinker. That's probably not Steve Pinker, not in 1985. You all know who Steve Pinker is? He writes all kinds of popular science books. Very interesting guy, but this is not him. Used a queuing with 10 possible targets, and what they find is that if you're not presenting the target at the queued location, it's sort of the reaction times speed up as you get, slow down as you get farther and farther away from the queued location. So it's not just this tight spotlight that you either attending or not attending to. It's like I'm attending to this location. The farther away I get from that, the bigger the impairment in performance that you see when you look at the results. Any questions about space-based attention? All right, so why is it called space-based attention? It's because I'm telling you, watch the door, something's going to happen there. And so you're attending to a location in space, right? So if some zombie comes through the door, you'll be quicker to detect it, as opposed to if the zombie tries to crawl through the window, you'll be slower, right? But you're attending to a particular location in space, right? So if you're a monitor, a security guard in a museum, and you know that if intruders are going to come in, they're much more likely to come in through one particular entrance. You'll attend to that monitor more than you will other monitors, a particular location in space. We do this kind of thing all the time. And by the way, a lot of magic works this way. So how does it work in magic?
The magician or whoever directs your attention to a particular spot, and you attend to that spot, and usually the magic happens, or the trick happens somewhere else.
Yeah, so I do something, hey, look, my fingers are wiggling, and then I do my dirty work down here. And a lot of magic is based on that. There's a show I like a lot called Foolish by Penn and Teller. Any of you watch that show? So they get magicians from all over the world. They come on the show, and if they can fool Penn and Teller, do a trick that they don't know how they did it, then they win a prize. And 80% of them don't fool them because they know a lot about how magic is done. But one of the techniques they use is to divert your attention so they can do a trick somewhere else. All right, I talked about feature-based attention last time. I'll just skip through this. But I will repeat this slide. So the idea here in feature-based attention, if you're looking for a particular feature like a color or the orientation of a line that's among a set of distractors that don't possess that feature, then that pops out. You can do that search in parallel. If it's a conjunction search like here and you're looking for a vertical red bar, this is a bit slower. And if you're looking for a spatial configuration of features, that is much slower still. And so this is another huge literature in attention which is focusing on searching for features. And again, we do this all the time. You drop your, anybody here wear contact lenses, right? You ever drop your contact lenses on the floor, right? And you're searching for that little bit of specular reflection that tells you it's there. Sometimes you can look a long while if it's in carpet or something. So this is a good example of a feature search. So parallel search, processing multiple stimuli at the same time. Serial self-terminating search, items are examined one after another until target is found. Again, I talked about this last time, so I'll skip through this. And that gets us to object-based attention. So here, right, you have two objects, one defined in red, one defined in black. You have the picture of a man or a picture of a building that are superimposed on each other. Yeah.
All right, sorry, I had a question about the slide with the feature-based stuff on it.
Which one?
The one before that one. This one. So like in synopsis, the more targets you have, the more distractions you have not related to the target, the less efficient it becomes.
Sometimes. All right, so it depends on what you're searching for. If you're searching for a single feature, red things among blue things, then the number of targets doesn't matter. That's an efficient search, and the idea there is that when you're looking for one feature, you can do that in parallel. When you're looking for multiple features at the same time, a red diagonal line, as opposed to a red horizontal line or a blue diagonal line, then the search becomes inefficient, and now you have, as the set gets bigger, your reaction time gets longer. And some configuration searches are harder than others. So this one, for example, the cost of the efficiency of the search goes down relative to that one. Any other question about this before I move on?
Would a conjunction search be series or parallel? One of them.
So conjunction search is where you're looking for two features. All right? So look in the class, look for somebody with red hair. Do you find her?
Yeah.
All right, as opposed to look for somebody with an orange shirt and black hair.
Okay.
Oh, there are two of you. Potentially three, depending on how loose you want to be about orange. All right, so in one case, you're looking for a combination of features, and that is slower, not done in parallel. And in the first case, you're looking for a single feature, and that you can do in parallel. Is that clear?
Oh, yeah, parallel. Yeah, you're right.
They're looking for red hair, that's fast. You're looking for red hair and gray shirt, that's not so fast. Any other questions about this? Okay, so let's move on now to object-based attention. So this is, attention is all or none of the features of an object. So if I look at a face, you're not really attending to a feature because a face has lots of, there's an eye, there's a nose, a mouth, there's hair, there's all the stuff that goes into a face, where in object-based attention, you group all those things together and you're attending to the group. Right? So I've been making a distinction between grouping and attention all along. Object-based attention is sort of they work together. All right? So you group something to form an object from all of its parts, right? And now you attend to the object, as opposed to just attend to the nose of the person's face. Or attend to the front door of the building, you attend to the whole building. Now, there's a famous study by Rock and Gutman. We'll get back to your observation before about whether you can attend to both objects at the same time. And so what they would do is they presented subjects with two overlapping images of different colors. So you see here, there's a green picture of a pencil and a red picture of a bell. And the instructions were, they were asked to make an aesthetic judgment, I don't think that's right. They were definitely not making ascetic judgments, they were making aesthetic judgments. I can't believe I haven't been using this slide for 10 years and never noticed that before. So they're asked to make an aesthetic judgment. So, is this a particularly good drawing of a bell? You just go, oh, that's a lovely bell, right? I rate that as very high on an aesthetic scale. I don't know what an aesthetic judgment would be. You know, is the bell calming? What have you. So anyway, they get a series of these things and they have to make a judgment, right? Is it aesthetically pleasing or not pleasing? And they go through a whole sequence of these. And then they're given a memory test. And on the memory test, they may be asked to say something about the pencil. And what subjects typically say is, what pencil? I didn't see a pencil. Right? So if you're making a judgment about the red thing and you're concentrating your attention on the red thing, it's as if the green thing doesn't even exist. So subject couldn't remember the unattended images in this case, at least in a memory task. Now here's another example of, I hope this animation works. So subjects are looking at a configuration like this. So they're fixating on the cross here. And notice there's a box and a triangle. And in one of these objects, the letter will blink on and off, saying that's the one that you're supposed to attend to. Now, you have a couple of options. I could say, all right, I'm going to attend to this location and see if an S is going to appear there later. But as you'll see, the objects move around, and it turns out that your attention moves with the object, even though they're looking for a particular letter. I'll try to show you how this works. All right, so they're cued, they see the box, and S blinks, and then the figures, the square or the triangle, move around. And if what it turns out is subjects are much faster if the S appears in the cued object than the uncued object, right? But not necessarily the cued location, right? So in this case, they're not focusing on a location, they're focusing on an object. The square, the S is part of the square object, and that's what the subject is attending to. Here's a more famous example. This is a study by Eagley, Driver, and Raffel in 1999. And so what they did is they presented subjects with configurations like this. So again, they're staring at a fixation point here, and there are two bars, like so. And the subjects would get a cue, and the cue consisted of, well, first of all, a target could appear at 4 possible locations. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they are cued before each trial by a red outline occurs around that particular location. All right, so in this case, the subjects get a cue that tells you there's a high probability that the target will appear at this location. So it's your standard space-based cueing design. However, notice in this experiment that you've got 2 different objects. And so the question is, if you get an invalid cue, will it matter if the invalid cue is on the same object, or if the invalid cue is on a different object but the same location from the cued, the same distance from the cued location? So 2 and 3 are both the same distance from 1, but 2 is part of the same object as 1, and 3 is on a different object. All right, let's see how that appears. So this is invalid cue, same object. So there's the cue, and there's the target. So subject is cued here, the target appears there. As opposed to invalid cue, different object. So here, There's the cue, tells you down and to the right, and the target appears up here. Now notice in both of these examples, the cue and the target are the same distance from one another, they're same spatial locations. But it turns out that you're faster in this case than you are in this case. And the reason for that is argued is that, well, you're attending to the object. So even if you're not at the right location, you are on the cued object. If we look at the data, it looks something like this. So if we have, so this is a valid cue, same object in gray, different object in black. So notice there are two effects going on here. If you get a valid cue and it's on the same location, the same object, that's when you're fastest. And this is the cue target SOA. So let's look at this bar here where the cue lasts for 300 milliseconds. So you're really fast if the target is at the cued location on the cued object. You're next fastest if the target is at a different location but on the same object as the one that was cued, and that you're slowest when you're at a different location and the target's on a different object as well, right? So what this is suggesting is, even though on the surface it looks like a regular space-based attention paradigm where I'm cueing a particular location, is that the subjects can't ignore the fact that the cued location is part of a whole object, and that's affecting their attention. No phones, please. Now what's interesting is this, is we can combine that with completion. So we have an example like this, where suppose I cue this and the target appears there. Would you expect to get an effect of the same object in this case, or a different object? And why? Yeah?
I'd expect the same effect because of amodal completion.
Because of amodal completion. Right, so even though in the image, these you would think might be separate objects, what your brain is doing is completing this, and you see this as one. And sure enough, the data look exactly the same as the data that I showed you a bit earlier. Again, so the main point that I want to make here is that you can't really separate attention and grouping, because a lot of times they're both operating at the same time and interacting with one another. Now, last time I showed you this diagram, which Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, RSVP, and this is just a demonstration that you can detect objects in a scene really fast. It turns out there's an interesting effect called the attentional blink, that once you've attended to the person that you see in this rapid serial visual presentation, there's a period of time where you're less able to detect other stimuli. So let's see how that works. So in this particular case, what you're supposed to do is, let's see, what is the task here? So you see a sequence of frames, black letters and white letters. And the task is, whenever you see a white letter, right, you should report either the next letter that appears, or the second letter that appears, or the third letter appears. So you get, there's some lag that you're supposed to report, right? So in one trial I might say, when you see a white letter, tell me the next letter that appears. Another trial, if you see a white letter, tell me the second letter that appears, or the third letter, or the fourth letter, etc. So everybody clear on the task. So in this case, if you're trying to report the second letter, the correct answer would be X. If you're trying to report the first letter, the correct answer would be H. Everybody clear on this task? So you're doing two things at once, right? Watch this really fast presentation. As soon as a white letter appears, then report to me some number of letters after that. And if you look at the data, what you find is this interesting effect that the subjects are very good at reporting the first letter, the white one, but then their performance drops off. So if you ask them to detect the second or the third level, they're really not very good at it. Whereas if you ask them to detect 6 letters later, they're much better. Now this may be counterintuitive. This phenomenon is what's called the attentional blink, right? So the idea is that once you've attended to something, then there's sort of a refractory period where your attentional resources have been exhausted for some period of time. All right, now what might be how could you exploit this? Say you were a criminal and trying to rob something from a store. What might you do?
Just do something that like causes a distraction type of thing.
Well, you might want to do it in pairs. So you have two robbers work together, right? So one robber comes in and grabs an item from the counter of the store. And then right after that, a second robber runs in and grabs another item. So the idea is that the clerk would be less likely to attend to the second robber. Now, if you're the first robber, this isn't helping you too much. You're going to be identified and caught. But for the second robber, you're likely to escape detection. Now, can anybody think of a context, people your age do this activity a lot, where you have to detect things at rapid sequences that occur in unpredictable ways? How many of you play video games? All right. Oh, this is unusual. It's all guys raising their hand. Oh, you do too?
Yeah.
What video game do you play?
I play Sims and Overwatch.
Okay. And you said Doom?
No, Sims and Overwatch.
Okay. Not a shoot 'em up game though.
I mean, Overwatch is kind of first-person shooter, I guess.
Okay. How many of you play a game where, monsters appear out of nowhere and you have to shoot them? What game is that?
Zombies on Call of Duty.
Oh, cool. Now, if you were zombies and you know about attentional blink, I guess that doesn't make much sense. What would your strategy be as zombies? Right? If you're a zombie, you don't care if you get killed or not. You're already dead. But you might want to work in pairs like the robbers I talked about before, right? So if the zombie comes running out of this alley and you shoot it, and then immediately after, another zombie comes running out of that alley, if you're less likely to detect the second zombie, then you might have your brains eaten. Yeah.
This reminds me of like the high school dodgeball technique to throw one dodgeball in the air, then like nail the person while they're looking at the one that you like threw in there. Like you lob up one that they could easily catch, and they're like, "Oh, I can catch you, get him out," and you just nail him. Yeah.
You're a cruel man.
I was just an observer.
Now, it turns out to be the case that, remember, you can learn hard strategies. So if we did this experiment to all the kids in the class, and we looked at their attentional blink, which is how far you drop off, turns out that the other students would show something like this, but you wouldn't, right? Because if you train a lot on tasks where it's really important that you detect targets that appear in quick succession, right? You learn the ability to do that. And so if this is an experiment done by Green and Bavelier, reported that people who play first-person shooter video games have reduced intentional blink. And this suggests that visual attention performance can be improved with practice. So here are the data for that. This is the intentional blink for non-video game players, and this would be experienced video game players. Yeah?
Is that kind of where you get the idea for like brain training apps? You know, like you'll have, I don't know, like only for flying in one direction, and you're supposed to hit the one that has or go in a different direction.
I don't know by the way, those brain training apps are completely bogus. Don't spend any money on them.
Like something along those lines, like where they.
I can't answer with certainty. I suspect not. And I thought most of those things involve sort of memory tasks, not rapid attention tasks, but I could be wrong on that. Yeah.
Is there any sort of, in the study, like false detection where they're anticipating, like on 5, 6, 7, and 8, because they've seen 3 or 4 before, that they're just kind of expecting to see something before they do?
Yes. Yes, you can definitely time this stuff. There's a bunch of research looking on that where the timing of when things occur can have a big effect on attention. So a good example of this would be, let's say you have a queue, and the queue tells you something's going to happen in 5 seconds, right? You'll be faster if it happens exactly 5 seconds later than if it happens longer or shorter period of time. So you can attend in time. In fact, one of the leading researchers on that was on the faculty here for many years before she retired, a woman named Mari Jones. But yes, you can, your attention can anticipate stuff.
So does that explain why they're faster further to the right of the graph than on the first one?
Well, except in this particular paradigm, right, you know what to anticipate. So you're told, give me the first target that appears after the red letter. Or you're told, give me the third target that appears. So, you know, you're in whatever anticipation process you're doing is the same. Now, maybe the source of this effect is it takes some while to process that anticipation. I don't think it's known exactly what the neuro details of why this effect occurs, but it's pretty robust. I mean, lots of people have studied this. Like 15 years ago, this was a very hot topic in cognitive psychology. I think less so now, but this is one of the effects you see in attention. Yeah?
For this, do the stimuli have to be the same type of thing? Or do they have to be the same type of thing that's being presented? Or is this the example that you used about magic? Where like you attend over here, or is it the spatial?
Yeah, so the point of this is that when you go through the act of attending, so I guess one way to think about it is this: attention requires some resources. And once you've used those resources, it takes a while to regenerate them. And therefore, before they're fully regenerated, you bear a cost in performance if you have to quickly now attend to something else. That's probably a good metaphor to think about it.
So is the magic example?
Oh, the magic example would be good, right? I get you to attend over here, and I do something quickly after that in a different location, and your attentional blink would also work in favor of the magician. I hadn't thought of that before, but you're absolutely right. Yeah?
On this graph, is number 1 where the letter is, or is that the first thing after the letter?
Number 1 is the, oh, that's a good question. I think it's the detection of the white letter. But I'm not sure, because performance ought to be higher than that. I don't know the answer to that. I apologize.
It should be the first.
It may be the first, I'm sorry?
Yeah, it should be the first letter because the x-axis.
This one?
No, just go back to that slide. The x-axis say it's the position of the T2 to the T1. Yeah. So you can see that's a T2, the T1, that's a T2. So the x should be.
You're right. It's the first target. So apparently the attentional blink builds up a little bit. So you're not as bad on the first target as you are on the second or third. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time now talking about attentional control. And this is and so I want to make a number of distinctions that go together. There are two kinds of attention, two modes of attention. And at a sort of as a first pass, one of them is automatic. Right? Say you're dozing off asleep and I clap my hands, right? Your head will shoot up. Other is top-down control. I tell you, search for somebody with blonde hair. So there are a number of things that cluster in this. So one is a distinction I'm going to make between sustained and transients. Things that suddenly appear out of nowhere it's a transient stimulus, right? There's been a change in what's there, as opposed to sustained, right? So you've been sitting here the whole class. You haven't done anything that to attract attention. But if all of a sudden a student just spontaneously appeared in that chair, every one of you would turn around and, what the hell? We've already talked about endogenous and exogenous. All right, exogenous is being driven by out in the world, whereas endogenous is being driven within you. This system is sometimes called controlled attention. I choose what I'm going to search for, whereas this is reflexive. If I throw something at you, you're going to jerk your head out of the way. This system is goal-driven. This stimulus is stimulus-driven. The speeds of them are quite different. This can be like 300 milliseconds, whereas this is 80 to 120 milliseconds. This one is largely cortical, but this one also has a subcortical component. Now, in order to tell you the story that I'm going to tell you, I need to go back and talk a little bit about visual anatomy that I left out when I was talking about the visual system. So this is a slide I've shown you before. So these are the pathways that go from the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus and on to the primary visual cortex. But there's also secondary pathways where the neurons branch off and go to this area here called the Superiorcolliculus and this area here called the pulvinar nucleus. And the Superiorcolliculus is the one that I want to focus on because this is not in the thalamus, it's in the midbrain. And all the neurons that go there are of the transient variety, right? They only respond to changes in the stimulus, not to static states. They're big neurons, they have a lot of myelination, so they have fast conduction speeds. And it turns out that this area of the brain is heavily involved in our most important attentional act, which is eye movements. All right, so the Superiorcolliculus is an area that is actively involved in controlling eye movements. So let's say all of a sudden a dog just spontaneously appears in the front part of the room, right? Every one of you would turn your head and eyes toward that dog. You can't stop yourself. All right, so this is an exogenous automatic attention that's being triggered by a transient. All right, now the converse case is suppose everybody in the room magically disappeared except for you. Well, because everybody disappeared, you wouldn't notice it, but that let's say half the class disappeared, right? You wouldn't respond as quickly to that as if a single thing appeared. And that may seem confusing now, but I'll show you some really compelling examples that I'm sure will convince you that that is the case. Now, one of the first experiments on this, you may look at that year and say, well, this guy Todd, he couldn't possibly have been publishing in 1979. This experiment is actually my doctoral thesis, was on this topic of automatic attention. And the way I got into it was sort of by accident. I was doing an experiment where subjects were supposed to move their eyes to a target, and I was measuring their reaction time. And I had one condition where where certain things would flash on the screen, and the subjects were supposed to not move their eyes. And it turns out that was almost impossible, right? So if you're at a screen and a letter flashes, you just can't stop yourself from moving your eyes over to look at it. And I thought, that'd be an interesting thing to study. And so that's what I did. And so I used two different paradigms. So in one case, you look at a fixation point at T1. At T2, there's a cue. The cue could either be the word inside or outside. So it tells you it's going to be at the two outer locations or the two inner locations. And then a letter would appear, a number would appear, and you'd have to respond, is it even or odd? That's the task. So this is the onset task. And then the no onset task is exactly the same, except that the target regions are not blank anymore. They're like the LEDs in your clock. So you can get any number by turning on various parts of these edges. So what happens, you turn everything off except for, right, these edges right there, and you get a 9. All right, so that's the task. In one case, the stimulus flashes on, and you have to say, is it even or odd? In the other case, all the lines on the screen turn off except for a letter, and those lines have been there all along, and you have to say, is it an even or odd? And the cue can either be valid or invalid. And let's see what the results look like. So here are the data. So these are the onset trials. Subjects are really fast at this, about 400 milliseconds. Much slower on the no onset. So this is the no onset task here, and this is the onset task. Right? So the onset task, you're responding to something that just flashes in your visual field, and you're about twice as fast to that as you are in the no onset condition. Right? So that onset of those lines is really capturing your attention. The other thing to note is that the cue has no effect at all on the onset task, and it has a substantial effect on the no onset task. All right, so this is an example where the onset stimuli are capturing your attention, you can't control it, you get really fast response times in that condition, and it's not affected by higher order cueing effects. If you go to the sustained one for the no onset stimuli, then you do get substantial cueing effects, and your reaction times are about twice as slow as they are in the onset case. Now this was followed a few years later by Ioannidis and Yantis and Ioannidis. Steve Yantis got famous for this paradigm. The trick is, if you have a new paradigm, you want to make sure you don't just do one and walk away and do other stuff. You got to keep it coming. Otherwise, if somebody else comes along and publishes multiple papers on it, then they're the ones that are going to get credit. Now, Steve always cited me. I mean, he's a good friend of mine, but nonetheless, if you ask someone who came up with this task, they all would certainly say, oh, that's Steve Yantis. But that's okay. I've done okay. So he did this in a visual search paradigm. So T1 is the target that you're supposed to search for. And so you're shown the target, and then you're shown a set of placeholders like this, the same ones I used, and there's an empty spot right here. All right? And then you see a set of letters. So you're told, search for a P. You again get a field that looks like this, and the P can either appear in this blank where it was an onset, right? Or it can appear in one of these places where it's a no onset. And it turns out that the target present onset, they're much faster than the target present no onset, and the target absent is even slower still. So again, two paradigms telling you that these onsets are playing a big role in capturing your attention. Right? Again, it doesn't have to be just the onset of a light. It could be an unexpected sound is doing the same thing. Or movement. If you're trying to get somebody, let's say your car's broken down, you're trying to get somebody's attention, what do? You wave your hands, right? What is that waving? You don't just stand there and cry, right? That's probably not going to help. You wave your hands. Why do you wave your hands? The waving of the hands is motion. It's transient. It's capturing attention. All right? William James talked about that. Now, the interesting thing about the transient channels is that they grab attention automatically when an unexpected event occurs. However, this system can be overloaded when there are multiple abrupt onsets at the same time. All right, you can flood the system. And there's a wonderful set of examples I'll show you that demonstrates this. I want you to watch this display and raise your hand when you see what's changing. I see 2 hands. 3. You're starting to get it. Amazing when you see it, right? You're still not getting it. That's 10 right there. Amazing, isn't it? See, now ordinarily, if there was nothing happening in this, well, there's a trick that makes this work. So if we were just sitting here and, the part of this line in the road was just appearing or disappearing, if that were an isolated transient, you'd see it in a second. So there's a couple of things they do here. They add all these boxes so you have other transients in different locations. And equally important, let's see if they do that here. I'll show you the next one. I'll show you the effect I was about to show. Raise your hand when you see what's changing here. You're not very good at this, are you? When I show you, you're going to be really, you got it. All right, so if any of you hadn't, you'll notice that this bar is moving up and down. Right, now if all I did is show you a picture where a bar is moving up and down, right, you detect that instantly. So the trick they use to make this one work is they put a blank frame in between the 2 pictures, right? So one picture comes on, there's a blank frame. It's just like blowing a big transient through your whole visual field. And then the other one comes on, and now that smaller change can't capture your attention anymore. Here's another example of this. Raise your hand if you see it. This was a little more subtle than the other 2. See, there is learning in this. I love it when you raise your hands. Everybody gets this nice smile and oh, I see it. So those of you, oh, sorry, this one here. The tree appears and disappears. And again, here they're using the same trick as in the other one. They're putting in a blank frame between the two images, again, to flood the field of transient. So ordinarily, an isolated transient will detect your, capture your attention like that. But if you have a whole flood of transients, then that system can break down, which makes it really hard to see changes that are taking place. All right, let me end by talking about disorders of visual attention. One of the most common ones is what's called visual field defect. And the patients who suffer from this, for whatever reason, are unable to attend to one side of the visual field. It's also sometimes called neglect. So a typical brain scan from a neglect. So here we have a patient with a lesion in the right hemisphere. And if you ask that subject to put a red line through all the blank lines that they see, they'll draw through all of these. They won't do any of those. Right? They just... Now, if you ask them, is there a line there? And the subject would say, oh, yeah, there is, isn't there? But they don't notice it unless you specifically prompt them. Yeah?
What if, could they look at the left side of the box of this? Like, I assume that they're looking right in the middle of.
Well, that's what you would naturally do if you were doing something like this. And of course, you can control that by varying the presentation times. But typically they will do this in free viewing. So here's another example where you ask them to draw a house, and that's what they draw. Now, if you ask the subject, isn't there another window over here? Somebody goes, oh, yes, there is. I didn't notice that.
What does copying have to do with, like, the transient aspect of this?
This doesn't. So this has nothing to do with transients per se. This is, remember, there are two kinds of attention. There's the top down and there's the bottom up. So if I'm drawing, if I ask you to, draw a picture of one of the other students in the class, what are you going to do? You're going to look at the other student, and then you attend to the page and you draw stuff, and then you look at the subject again and draw. So it's very top down. It's not driven by transients. I don't know of any deficits in the transient detection. They probably exist. But remember, we're talking about lower brain centers there. So, you have a lesion in your midbrain. That's a lot more detrimental than if you have one in the cortex. You can tolerate lesions in the cortex a lot more easily than you can lower down. So let me show you a movie. What this class close at 5 minutes? All right, I'll let you go. I'll leave time to ask questions. I would encourage you to watch this. It's embedded in the PowerPoint. Take a look at it. It gives a little more information about the neurophysiology of neglect, and also shows some, interviews patients who have it while they're doing some of these tasks, which is pretty interesting. All right, I will let you go. If anybody needs to ask me any questions, I will be in my office tomorrow afternoon, and I'm also available over email. All right, so good luck on the test on Thursday, and I'll see you then.